Let's talk Panigale V2 versus Panigale V4 and why they're a lot more similar than you think. This video is going to be coming from an owner's perspective. It's not as if, I own a V4 and I'm borrowing a V2 for the day just to compare them. This is coming from my ownership experience. I've owned both a V2 and a V4 for a period of time. I actually owned both the bikes at the same time. This is a 2021 Ducati Panigale V2. The V2 has a 955cc 90-degree twin-cylinder engine with 155 horsepower and 76.7 foot-pounds of torque. Current MSRP on these bikes for a 2024 Panigale V2 is $18,795, and they have a dry weight of 388 pounds. Seat height is at 33.1 inches, and Ducati considers this their middleweight practical Panigale. For those that don't follow the channel, the 2021 Panigale V2 that you guys just saw, it recently changed hands. A very close friend of mine purchased it, but prior to that, I owned that bike since new. I bought that bike brand new in 2021. And all the modifications you guys see on the V2, those are all things that I did during my ownership. So the wheels, rear seat delete, the carbon pieces, levers, mirrors, windscreen, turn signals, fuel lid, the exhaust. This is an Austin Racing exhaust. Absolutely awesome sounding bike. Let's go ahead and do a cold start for you. Here we go. Just a crazy sounding combination, the V2 with an Austin Racing exhaust from Brentune. That tone, that aggressiveness, pretty tough to beat. But without further ado, let's check out the V4. This is a 2023 Ducati Panigale V4. The V4 has an 1103cc 90-degree V4 engine, 210 horsepower and 90.6 foot-pounds of torque. Dry weight, 386 pounds, seat height, 33.5 inches, and has a current MSRP of $24,995. Besides some of the special models like the SP2 and the MotoGP replicas, the V4 is considered top of the range. And since I don't want anybody to be upset with me, let's go ahead and give this one a cold start too. So you've got some similarities, of course. They're both Panigales, but you have some pretty stark differences there as well. One being a V4, one being a V2, one being 210 horsepower, one being 155 horsepower, one being a wide body with aero, the other being a real slim, very simplistic design, one being brand new architecture, the other being kind of inherited architecture from the prior generation. Aspects of the bike that actually look exactly the same, V4 to V2, they are actually different, surprisingly. Here's the V2 right next to the V4. We can compare them. You can see how much slimmer the V2 is. I mean, that's a really narrow bike, whereas the V4 is actually a pretty wide bike. When we look from behind, it's even more obvious, but parts like this nose piece, it looks like it's the same as the V2. It looks identical. However, when you look close, you can see how much wider even the nose piece is. So at this nose piece, look at how wide it is here. Now look at the V2. Look how slim it is. Now let's step back a bit. Look at how narrow the architecture is on the V2, how narrow the tank is, how narrow the frame is, how all the suspension, all the mechanical portions are very tight to the center of the bike. Whereas look at how wide the V4 is. The tank, the fairings, even the engine covers, everything is just much wider. The way the seat is, look at how much wider the seat is compared to the V2. So the great thing about the V2 design, about this very narrow, slim design, is it makes the bike feel like it's much smaller than it really is. When you ride a V2, it doesn't feel like you're riding a 955cc, 155 horsepower bike with a tune and exhaust. Take all the smog stuff off, and probably 165 horsepower. It doesn't feel like that big of a bike because of how slim it is. The V4, much wider design, the fairings, the nose piece, the tank, everything, much wider design. So it doesn't let you forget that this is a leader bike. Even just in normal traffic, just cruising on the freeway, you never forget how big of a bike this is. It's not gonna trick you into thinking, maybe I'm on a 600 or something like that, like the V2 does. However, the advantage is with that wide design, you actually have a very big cockpit, so to speak. So you don't get near as much wind buffering. On the V2, the wind buffering is not bad, but the V4 is very comfortable on the freeway and at high speed because of that wider design. You just have a wider, kind of bigger air capsule around you, and that's something that I noticed right away going from V2 to V4. And I noticed a lot of people don't talk about that. They just talk about how wide the V4 feels. Some people talk about how unnecessarily wide that it feels. I do agree with that. You're not going to forget that you're on a V4, but again, the advantage is for a long ride where you're going to be on the freeway a lot. The V4 is quite a bit more comfortable, not because of the seating position, but because you have a wider and larger air bubble around you. Aesthetically, I think the V4 is the better looking of the two. It's more aggressive. It's got the arrow, it's got all the vents and fins and everything. It's just a wild looking motorcycle. I do like the color scheme as well, with the black Ducati, black Panigale, black decal on the tank, which is cleared over. So I think out of the two, the V4 does look better. However, to be fair to the V2, the V4 has gone through various updates through its life, whereas the V2 has pretty much stayed the same since its inception. The 2018 and 2019 V4s actually didn't even have winglets at all. They were a narrow body, just like the V2. In 2020 and 2021, winglets were added, and then in 2022, the winglets were changed to this design. Additional vents were placed down at the bottom. Tank shape is different, but basically 2020 plus V4s are going to be this wide body design. That being said, the Panigale V2 has aged very, very well. This is still a very nice looking motorcycle. When I had this bike, I would still get stopped all the time and have people ask me questions about it. People notice this bike. Even people who don't know anything about motorcycles, they can kind of tell it's something different, a little bit special. You do get that attention there. So for not being updated for a very long time, for being basically the same aesthetically throughout its whole life, this bike has aged very, very well.
All right, just filled up the V4. We're gonna take it for a little spin here. If you guys haven't already, make sure you hit that like, hit that subscribe, do a quick little walk around. All right, let's go ahead and hop on. We'll just go for a short low ride here. I want to show you guys, I want to highlight the engine on these bikes. So what we hear a lot is the Panigale V2 is the kind of tame one. It's the one that you can ride around. The V4 is just too crazy, pure race bike. It's not something that you would want to use for normal duties. And what I'm going to show you here is that's not true at all. One thing, the same as the V2, the clutch engagement point is pretty far out, and it's kind of on off. It's not real bad, it's not hard to ride or anything, but the clutch is definitely more touchy than most other bikes that I've ridden. Actually, all the other bikes that I've ridden. But what I want to highlight here is, see, just cruising third gear, 50 miles an hour, no big deal. When you saw me going up through the gears, no issue at all. Pretty docile, these bikes. They're pretty soft down low. So if I kind of chop the throttle, you definitely feel that there's power there for sure. you can tell it's a powerful motorcycle, but it's not coming out from under you. It's not, and I mean, I was being pretty reckless with the throttle there. I mean, on an RS V4, you'd pretty much tear your head off there. So, and on the V2, as you guys will see in a little bit, it's kind of the same thing. You can be pretty rough with the throttle, and it's really not that big of a deal. These bikes, they're pretty forgiving. What I hear a lot of people say with these bikes is, it's not for the street. The V2 is the better option. The V4 is the pure race bike. You're not going to be able to use it. It's not very rider friendly, and that's just not true. Of course, the V4 has a lot more top end power. It's got a lot more horsepower, peak horsepower, quite a bit more torque as well, but not a ton more. But the characteristics are very similar between the two engines, where you're kind of waiting for the power to come on. Once the power comes on, V4 is going to be stronger, but they're both pretty, I would say they're pretty unspectacular down low. Even cruising around here in first gear, you guys, right? I mean, as long as you're not, just don't do stupid stuff, and you're completely fine. You can cruise here at 30 miles an hour. You can see the engine's not jerking, the bike's not, bucking or anything like that. It's perfectly fine at these lower speeds just to ride around. It's just, it's not a big deal. Modern acceleration, very, very docile. So down low, this is 4,000, 4,500 RPM. I can give it, 3/4, half throttle, and just kind of throttle up there, pick up some speed and make my pass or make my yellow light or whatever it is. Maybe somebody's driving kind of weird, you can tell they're not paying attention, you want to get away from them. It's easy to do that, and this bike is actually not bad to just use. I don't think the Panigale V2 is significantly better as just a bike to ride around. It's better in certain ways in that it's narrower and it feels like a smaller bike. In that sense, it is better. But it's not significant, when people compare the two, they make it seem like the engine alone just makes it a completely different motorcycle. And for on the track and things like that, yeah, that's probably true. This video is not in the context of track riding. This is just as a motorcycle, riding around, have a little bit of fun sometimes, and that's it. In that sense, it's not significantly different. And the way it's different is when you really open it up all the way. You're trying to go fast, you're wringing out the motor, you have a lot more RPM. In that sense, yes, it is a lot different. And you got people saying, oh man, a V4, it should be on the track, you should be doing this with that, should be going to Button Willow, you should be going to Thunder Hill, you should be doing this and that, whatever. That's fine, that's your opinion, but I mean, I don't know why you care so much about what other people are doing. And for most of us who ride these bikes, we don't track them. I mean, if for whatever reason, I don't have any, I have some experience tracking cars, but for whatever reason, I just don't have interest in tracking a motorcycle, at least at this point. And even if I did want to track a motorcycle, it wouldn't be a Ducati. It's just, they're too expensive to fix if you crash them. The maintenance is, you're going to be paying a little bit more for parts and stuff like that, so a little more finicky. So I wouldn't want to ride one of these anyways for a track bike, but regardless, it doesn't matter. It's just, if you want to buy one of these and just let it sit in your garage, then that's nobody's business. You can do that. It's your money. Do whatever you want. And with this V4, all the bikes that I have, I just want to use them for just traveling. I want to just use them as transportation, and I don't see why it matters what I do with it. So let's go ahead, we're gonna hop on the V2 just for a moment. I think the audio is gonna be a little bit harder to hear because how loud that exhaust is, but we'll go ahead and hop on it. I'll show you guys. It has less top end power, but the characteristics of the engine, they're pretty similar.
Whew, it's getting hot already. That was the Panigale V4. Let's hop on the Panigale V2.
All right, here's the Panigale V2. So this bike, a little more docile, but not by much. And characteristics very similar. You can see here here, I'm on a similar roadway as what we were on with the V4. It's got a second, third gear. You have less RPM to work with, but pretty soft down low. These engines, they're kind of like the V4 in that they're just unspectacular down low. There's just not much down low. They're not very punchy. But as you guys will see here in a little bit, when you rev it up, when you get into the power band, when the motor's happy, it's going to get you going pretty good here, but not to the extent of a V4. Bikes is they're very nimble, they're very narrow, so in that sense they're a little bit better in tight quarters around town on the street, but it's again, they're not drastically different. You do get used to the wider and bigger V4. Even at a low speed like this at 50 miles an hour, I noticed that the air cockpit is a lot smaller on the V2, so I'm getting a lot more wind, even though I have there's a taller windshield on this bike. Even with that, I'm getting a lot more wind resistance being on this. It's just a smaller motorcycle, and everybody's going to be different. You know, obviously if you're larger, then it's going to affect you more. You know, luckily I'm on the smaller side, so I don't think it's as big of a deal. It's not the end of the world, but it's definitely there, and I don't see a lot of people talking about that. Just to pass and stuff like that, I can leave it in fourth gear, which is really kind of too tall of a gear for this speed. But let's say if I need to pass this black SUV here, it's gonna roll it on. You know, there we go. Put on 15 miles an hour or so very easily. Not a big deal without being out of control. Quick shifter, pretty similar to the V4. Good, I would say very good, but not great, not excellent. There's definitely other quick shifters out there that are better, but it's not bad at all. Up and down is relatively smooth, but could be better. As far as the ride quality goes, pretty similar. The V4 might ride a little bit harder, but that could also have to do with how the suspension's adjusted, but they're relatively similar. You know, handling, I would say the V4 is a little bit more stable on kind of long sweeper type of turns, and the V2 is going to be a little more nimble, just because of how narrow it is. It feels lighter than it really is. It's actually similar weight to the V4. The V4 is not significantly heavier, but I think because of how big the tank is and maybe how the weight's distributed, the V4 it feels heavier even though it's not, basically. Yeah, very nice bike to ride. This bike it feels like I'm riding like a 500 or 600 cc motorcycle. Again, even how the engine responds, it's not really ferocious. It's not really even like that. That was a pretty good amount of throttle there, like maybe 50% throttle, and you saw that the acceleration was not crazy. It was very poised, very smooth. It just kind of gets you up to the speed that you want, and that's it. It's a very composed engine. In kilometers an hour, folks, so no speed limits violated there. But so a quick little rip there, just kind of going through the gears. As you guys saw, pretty strong. When it gets into power band, you certainly feel it. It'll put you back in the seat for sure. It's not as strong as a V4, but it's got plenty of power. notice, the RPM that I'm at on the V2 and the V4, it's pretty similar. I'm pretty much operating 4,000 to 6,000 RPM just in normal riding. So the RPM range that you're just, you know, riding around in, it's pretty much the same between the two. And again, I know it's hard to kind of portray it on video, but the engine characteristics, they're very similar. A lot of people talk about, you know, how torquey these twins are. They are torqueier than most of the inline options and stuff like that, but it's not crazy, it's not insane. All right, and that's the Panigale V2.
And we are back. So let's talk about what we just saw there. Now the V4, when you're ringing out that 1103cc V4 engine, it feels like the RPMs are just never gonna end. The V2, you don't get that sensation. It of course has a pretty high RPM. I think with the brand tune, it's right around 12,000 RPM. So that's plenty. But a V4, you're more like 15,000 RPM. And just the way the bike revs, the way it builds power, it feels like those RPMs are just never going to stop. During that ride, I did mention seating position. So on the V4, it is a more aggressive seating position. If you look at just how the seat is constructed, it's a flatter seat, it's a harder seat. There's less cushion compared to the V2. When we look at the V2, a lot more padding on it, not quite as flat. So it is a little narrower as well, just because of the way the tank is shaped. We talked about that earlier compared to how wide the V4 is shaped. Look at how wide the seat is in this area. So the seating position is more aggressive on the V4. However, when I went from V2 to V4, you do get used to it pretty quickly. It's not so significant that it bothers you for a long amount of time, but it is there, you do notice it. Let's talk about maintenance and ease of service. So again, the V2, it is based on 959-1299 architecture. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. And the V4 is basically all new architecture. Some things have been changed and updated, but it's basically a new platform. So what most people say is the V4 is easier to work on because it's on that new architecture. There's some nuance to that. The V4 is easier to work on in some aspects, but more difficult in others. Let's take a look. So on the V2, you'll notice the way the rear hugger is, the way the rear sets are, how they have the suspension set up. It's very similar to that 959-1299 architecture. A lot of the parts actually are cross-compatible. Even the way they have the exhaust, very similar to the older Panigales. Whereas the V4, if you look at how the suspension is mounted, everything is quite different on the V4s. The way the frame is, it's completely different. There's some similarities, the way the triple trees are and the way the steering dampener is and stuff like that. Some similarities there. Even the buttons are different on the V4. So if you look here, okay, let's look at the V2. And you can see a little bit different the way the button array is. If you go to the other side, same thing, just slightly different. This one here has a little bit more modern style buttons. You guys will notice on the tank, the V4s have this access cover, which is great. When you open this cover, you have access to the battery. The air filter is also a lot easier to access, whereas the V2, you have to lift up the tank, remove a lot of these components here to get to the air filter. The battery on these bikes, on the V2s, again, is like the older Panigales where they're mounted on the side, which means you have to remove this upper fairing here to get to it, which is kind of a pain. The complexity of the V4, however, shows when we start talking about the fairings. The fairings on the V4s are a little more difficult to take off than the V2s. And part of that reason, let me get on the other side here, is if you look at how the fairings are on the V4, look at how this upper fairing comes all the way up onto the tank, right? So you have to be really careful. You're not scratching anything. And this is kind of strange on the clutch side on a V4. There is, it might be real hard to see, but there's actually an air duct in there. It's right there. So that air duct interfaces with this lower fairing. So when you remove the lower fairing, you've actually got to remove that air duct as well. Comes off pretty easy, but putting it on is kind of a pain. So just little things like that. I would not necessarily agree that the V4 is totally is 100% easier to work on as opposed to a V2. And I hate that Ducati did not update this design for the V4s. The windscreens on V4s, you still have to take the whole nose piece off, just like the V2s. I don't know why they insist on doing it that way. When you look at something like an Aprilia, as well as a lot of other bikes, you don't have to remove the whole nose piece. You just remove these 4 fasteners, and then there's a kind of like a tab that slips in down here at the bottom. Whereas the Panigales, including the V4s, you have to remove these, which means you have to take that whole nose piece off just to change the windscreen. Panigales and heat, those two things go together like peanut butter and jelly. Between the two, I think stock for stock, the V4 is hotter than the V2. I actually got heat blisters on the inside of my leg when I had the V4 with the stock exhaust and stock flash. So just by that metric alone, I never had that issue with the V2. So just by that alone, I would say the V4 probably is hotter. However, after an exhaust, after a flash, which if you have one of these bikes, that's what you're gonna do. I mean, you don't see too many Panigales with a stock exhaust on it. Once you do that, they're pretty similar. They both get very hot. However, once you change the exhaust, once you flash it, the heat it's significantly better. It is night and day difference when you do that. So let's do some cliff notes here. What did we learn today? The V4, it is a wider and bigger motorcycle. It's physically larger, and it doesn't let you forget that. The V2, very narrow. It kind of plays a trick on your mind because of how narrow it is. I mean, that bike, it is a similar weight to the V4 on paper. However, when you're actually riding it, it feels much lighter and much smaller. As far as heat goes, similar. There's probably, some difference, but it's not appreciable. Power, you're gonna have a lot more with the V4, but you don't really feel it unless you're really wringing it out. And the V2 is no slouch, as you guys saw earlier. It has plenty of acceleration, it has plenty of power. It doesn't have the RPM that the V4 has. So once they hit power band, the characteristics of the engine changes quite a bit. But for normal riding, for anything that you're, below 9,000 RPM on the street, which on the street in most situations, that's where you're going to be at. They're pretty similar in the way they make power, in the way the RPMs climb, in the way the engine reacts when it hits power band. It's pretty similar between the two. They're probably more in a street application. They're more similar than they are different. Appearance, this is subjective. Some people like the simplicity of the V2 design and the narrow body V4 design. I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I like the more aggressive kind of fins and vents on the current V4. However, for most people, they really can't tell the difference between the two. They both have single side swing arm. They're both red generally with some exceptions. The front ends are pretty much the same. The tail section's the same. The tail light's the same. The wheels are even the same. When you look at a base V4 and a base V2, the width of the rear wheel is different, but the design itself is the same. Both have Brembos. The base V4 and base V2 both have the Showa front forks. I mean, the location of the rear suspension is different, but I mean, most people aren't going to notice that. They look, appearance-wise, they're not way different from each other. Now in price, that's going to be a factor too. Obviously the V4 is significantly more expensive. If you go up to a V4S or any of the special models, V4R, SP2, it's going to increase that gap even more. But that is a consideration. And everybody has their budgets, but I think the point of this video here is if you can't afford a V4, if you just like the V4, it's just what you want, you like the way it looks better, you like the way it sounds better, whatever the case may be, and you're planning on just using it to ride around, maybe some canyon runs sometime, maybe you hop on the freeway with friends once in a while, something like that. Don't let all the people who tell you that it's a terrible road bike, it's a terrible choice to just use as transportation, because it's just not true. It is a sport bike. It's not going to be as comfortable as a Goldwing or something like that, but they're not as bad as people think. And in that context, the V2 and the V4 are not really that different. So there we go, guys. I hope that was helpful. Again, this is a perspective from an owner. This is not somebody, I'm not somebody who rode both of these bikes for an afternoon and tried to form an opinion. I owned the Panigale V2 for years, and I put 1,000 miles on this V4, just about 1,000 miles. And not that I'm an expert or I know everything, but after my experience with these two bikes, they're really not that different, you guys. And I think it goes back to, it's like everything else. There's good things about the V4, there's good things about the V2, there's bad things about the V4, and there's bad things about the V2. You just have to choose, if those bad and good things really matter to you or not. If you're somebody who enjoys a really light, very narrow, small feeling bike, then yeah, the V2 is going to be a great choice, because there's very few bikes that are this size with this much power that give you that illusion that it's actually much smaller than it really is, much smaller and lighter than it really is. Or if you're someone like me who just wanted a V4 just because I just wanted one. I actually think the V2 with this exhaust setup sounds better than the V4s do. So my choice wasn't based on sound. I just wanted a V4 just because I wanted to try one out. I wanted to see what it was all about. And I quickly figured out that a lot of these things that people say about V4s there's some truth to it, but there's a lot of nuance. And I think people don't understand those nuances because they're not explained clearly. And I think some of those nuances occur when people review these bikes, but they haven't actually lived with them. So if you stayed this long, all the way to the end here, thank you so much for joining me. Please like, please subscribe, share this video with a friend. We'd really appreciate that. I hope this video was helpful. Anyways, until next time, see you on the next one.